Thank you so much. It's a very great pleasure to be here, and I much appreciate the invitation to be able to moderate this panel. We have 3 papers, as Michael said. The first one will be presented by Laura Quinby from Boston College. How has COVID-19 affected the labor force participation of older workers? She will, you can share your screen if you will, Laura, and while I finish discussing the other 2, we can kick things off. The second paper will be presented by Emily Jackson from Michigan State, the impact of COVID-19 on older workers' employment and Social Security spillovers. And saving maybe the best for last, David Weir from the University of Michigan will be talking about assessing the economic impact payment in the older population. So Laura, take it away.
Well, thank you, Olivia. And thank you to everyone who helped organize this meeting. I am delighted to be here, sharing a paper that I co-authored with my colleagues at Boston College, Matt Rutledge and Gal Wetstein. How has COVID-19 affected the labor force participation of older workers? Sorry. So I'd just like to begin with the standard disclaimer that all of the conclusions and findings in this paper are our own and don't represent the government or Boston College. So before COVID-19, the percentage of 62-year-olds claiming Social Security was declining. As you can see from this figure, which plots the percentage of individuals turning 62 who claimed at 62 by birth year, there has been a steady decline since the late 1990s. And the question that we're asking in this paper is, did the pandemic interrupt this trend, given that it interrupted just about every other aspect of the normal work environment? To answer this question, we examine the employment transitions of older workers that we define as ages 55 plus before and during the pandemic. And specifically, we're asking for 3 questions. Did older workers respond to COVID-19 by retiring early? Who were these early retirees? What demographic, economic, and public health characteristics correlate with the decision to retire early? And we will discuss whether older workers may try to re-enter the labor force as the pandemic recedes. The data for our analysis comes from the monthly Current Population Survey, or CPS. Now, the CPS is not designed to follow individuals over time, but respondents do appear in the survey in multiple instances. So they are interviewed for 4 consecutive months, then they exit the survey for 8 months, and they re-enter for another 4 consecutive months. What we do is we observe respondents in their 4th month interview, and we see who are working at that point. And then we look at them again in the 16th month and see if they're still working. What we find is that before the pandemic, about 15% of older workers left employment over the course of a year. But that post-pandemic, the share rose to about 23%. Now, the figure I'm showing here plots the percentage of older workers who leave employment over the course of the year by month, starting in January 2019 through November 2020, which is the endpoint of our analysis, because it is before the sort of widespread advent of vaccines. And the x-axis on this graph is showing the month of the respondents' last CPS interview, so the 16th month. And as you can see, there was a big jump in the share of older workers leaving their jobs between March 2019 and March 2020, but the rate remained elevated long after that point. And the average difference between the pre-pandemic rate and the post-pandemic rate was 8 percentage points. The next step in our analysis was to determine whether certain groups were particularly affected by the pandemic. And to do this, we consider 4 categories of worker attributes. The first is age and health. And I should note here that the health variables in our analysis, because of the data, really measure limitations of activities as opposed to underlying conditions that might predispose a worker to COVID-19. The second category is demographic characteristics, such as gender and race. Third category is working conditions, in particular, whether the worker has the ability to work remotely from home or telework, as well as education, which we view as a proxy for unobserved job attributes such as access to health insurance or scheduling flexibility. And the fourth category is county pandemic conditions, including the peak COVID death rate in the county during the interval when the respondent was interviewed, and the lowest employment rate in the county during that period. So we do use regression analysis to try to isolate the different impact of these factors, but I'm not going to go into the details of our methodology. Instead, I'm going to skip right to the results and highlight that we found that COVID-19 particularly impacted women, Asian Americans, workers without a college degree, and those unable to work remotely. So specifically, women we found were 2 percentage points more likely to leave employment during the pandemic than men. Asian Americans were 7 percentage points more likely to leave than non-Hispanic white workers. Those with a bachelor's degree were 4 percentage points less likely to leave than those without a college degree. And those able to telework were 4 percentage points less likely to leave than those unable to work remotely. However, despite the 8 percentage point increase in separations during the pandemic, the share of workers who self-reported leaving the labor force due to retirement was only 1 percentage point higher post-COVID during our analysis period. It rose from about 12% in the pre-pandemic period to about 13% in our post-pandemic period. And the increase in retirements was concentrated among workers who were ages 70 or older. So again, we used regression analysis to see whether certain characteristics were more associated with the decision to leave the labor force and retire. What I want to highlight in this figure is the solid red bar at the bottom, which shows that workers ages 70 plus were 6 percentage points more likely to self-report retirement than workers ages 55 to 59. However, workers ages 60 to 69 were not significantly more likely to self-report retirement than those ages 55 to 59. And the other demographic characteristics that I discussed in the context of separation really didn't predict the move to retirement. Consistent with this story, we found that claiming rates for Social Security retirement or OASI benefits have not increased. So here we're using publicly available administrative data from the SSA to track the monthly benefit applications for Social Security retirement benefits between April 2019 and April 2021. As you can see, the trend is really flat. And we also saw that the share of workers expecting to claim retirement benefits in the next year was also flat. So to confirm our prior finding, we looked at the Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey, which was developed during the pandemic to collect detailed, timely data on economic and other behaviors. And we looked at the share of older individuals who state that they expect to claim their Social Security retirement benefits within a year. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any pre-pandemic data to look for pre-existing trends, but as you can see, between August 2020 and February 2021, there really has not been an increase in the share of workers who state that they expect to claim their retirement benefits. So taken together, we think that these findings suggest that some older workers may try to re-enter the workforce after the pandemic has eased. Some may have always planned to continue working, and their outcomes in retirement are ultimately going to depend on their ability to find a new job post-pandemic and the quality of that job in terms of salary and benefits relative to the job that they held previously. Other workers may have always planned to retire, but delayed claiming Social Security because they had alternative sources of income that they could tap in the short run. So to briefly conclude, we find that many older workers left their jobs because of COVID-19. This is perhaps unsurprising. Many workers left their jobs because of COVID-19. Older workers were no exception. But we do not yet know how this disruption will affect their outcomes in retirement. We do think some may turn to Social Security once alternative sources of income have run out, but others will try to find new jobs. And the real question here is, will they succeed? Will they be able to find jobs in a timely manner? And what will those jobs look like? And it may take us a few years before we know the full answer to those questions. So with that, I will wrap up.
Thank you very much. You can stop sharing and we'll move right along with alacrity to Emily Jackson.
Great, I'll share my screen now. Okay, great. Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Laura, for your great presentation. Our paper is very closely related to what Laura just talked about. So we're going to look at the impact of COVID-19 on older workers' employment and Social Security spillovers. And this work is joint with Gopi Shah-Goda, Laura Nicholas, and Sarah Stitt. Before I begin, the standard disclaimer, anything we talk about today are our own opinions and not that of the US government. So the motivation of our paper is relatively straightforward. So the COVID-19 global pandemic had unprecedented economic and social disruption to our society. And so given this, there's a particular threat to older and disabled workers. So for example, there were higher rates of mortality among those at older ages. And additionally, prior research has shown that these workers are also more vulnerable to permanent labor market or exits during recessions. So given this, we're going to ask the following two questions in the paper. So first, how have older workers' employment outcomes evolved over the course of the COVID pandemic? So relative to what we would have expected if the pandemic had not occurred, how have these outcomes evolved? And then second, we're going to look at whether or not the COVID pandemic changed Social Security, disability, and retirement applications. We're going to combine 3 sources of data today, and we also look at Google Trends data, but I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's in the paper if you are interested. The results with the Google Trends show similar results to what we're going to show today. So the first is going to be the CPS, which is the same data that Laura was just talking about. We're going to look at individuals who are age 50 through 70, and specifically, we're going to divide these individuals into 2 groups, the 50 through 61-year-olds, and then 62 to 70. And so that division is just based on eligibility for claiming retirement benefits. We're going to use the years 2015 and through March 2021 for all of our data sets. And we're also going to bring in, so the CPS is going to give us information on individuals' employment. And then we're also going to bring in SSA administrative data on applications. And so the next 2 data sets are going to have applications for disability insurance, and we're going to be able to divide those between applications for SSDI versus SSI only, and concurrent SSDI and SSI applications. And then finally, we're also going to have, I should mention that the SSA disability insurance applications are by state by month. However, the retirement benefits applications are at a national level, but we can differentiate between applications filed online versus offline. So let me show you what we find. So the way you should interpret the results that I'm showing you are, these are monthly deviations based on what we would have expected given typical seasonality and typical trends prior to the pandemic. And then the deviations are relative to February 2020. And so these are how the deviations evolved over time. So first, look on the left here. So this is employed. The way the graph is structured is the red dashed line shows you where February 2020 is. And the black coefficients are going to show you the 50 through 61-year-olds. And then the gray coefficients are going to show you the 62 to 70-year-olds. You can see for both age groups, there's a sharp decline in employment that peaks in April 2020 of about 10 to 15 percentage points, and then slowly recovers and levels off in the later months. In terms of individuals who are employed but absent, so these are people who hold a job but are absent either due to illness, being on furlough, etc. This also peaks in April 2020, but almost recovers to zero, and we don't see this being a large factor in the later months of the pandemic. Now I'm going to separate the employment effects into the two subcomponents where this is coming from. So part of this decrease in employment is coming from increases in unemployment, but also increases in labor force exits. So NILF stands for not in the labor force. So again, we see that these results are peaking in April 2020. And for the younger group, so the 50 to 61-year-olds, about 62% of our employment effect is coming from unemployment, and about 28% is coming from not in the labor force. So unemployment is a large factor for this younger, older group. And the pattern that you see for unemployment is you see this sharp increase and then it steadily declines. So unemployment is going to steadily decline throughout the pandemic. Whereas when you look at labor force exits, again, it peaks slightly in April 2020, but then it stays at a maintained higher level than we would have expected. Turning to the 62 to 70-year-olds, we see a similar pattern. However, the unemployment only makes up about 50% of the employment effect, and then labor force exits makes up a larger portion for the older workers. And so that's a 42% of the employment effect coming from labor force exits. And if we further divide the labor force exits for the older group into subcomponents, so you can exit the labor force either due to retirement, disability, or other. The older group is going to be partially split between labor force exits due to retirement and labor force exits due to other, whereas the younger group is largely being driven by labor force exits due to other. And so we sort of think of the other group as maybe the wait and see. So they're not fully considering themselves retired yet, but they're also not actively looking for work. When we look at SSA applications, we see the following. So we see a large decrease in Social Security disability applications, and this is peaking in May 2020. And if we divide this decrease into its subcomponents, we see that it's largely coming from a decrease in applications for SSI only and concurrent applications. So SSI only, the application, this accounts for 55% of the decrease in applications, and then concurrent accounts for 30%. So predominantly, we think the driver of this decrease is coming through applications for SSI specifically. Finally, we're going to look at applications for retirement. So on net, we see no change in Social Security retirement applications relative to what we would have expected. However, we find an interesting pattern that's perhaps not surprising. We see a shift in applications being filed via the internet rather than filed offline. While not surprising, we think this might have important implications in how people moving forward choose to apply, and this may stick around and people might be more likely to apply via the internet in the future. So in terms of heterogeneity, we do a lot of different sub-analyses to find out where the heterogeneity is coming from. But at a high level, let me just summarize our key findings. So we find that the reduction in disability is concentrated among the most vulnerable groups. So individuals with lower education, minorities, and those who live alone. We find that the increase in retirement is largely concentrated among those with high education who are white and also who live alone. In terms of the employment results and in terms of the Google search intensity, which I didn't show you today, we do see that reductions were larger in employment in states that were more shut down, so that had stay-at-home policies that were more strict or lasted for longer periods of time. And then they had similarly larger increases in unemployment in labor force exits. However, one thing that we do find is that differences in disability applications did not change differentially based on how shut down a place was. And then finally, we do see that employment reductions were also more pronounced in states that had a higher share of people who were employed in jobs that were both non-teleworkable and non-essential. So we consider these types of jobs, those to be the most vulnerable to the pandemic. So now let me just take the last little bit of time to talk about potential mechanisms. So there's both demand side and supply side factors that could be leading to these results. And we're able to say a little bit on some of these results. And just sort of at a high level first, we do find evidence of both demand side and supply side factors being at play. So in terms of employment, demand side factors could be things such as the shutdowns leading to business closures or reduced demand from consumers. On the supply side, people might have to stay home from work because they need to provide care either for children or for their older parents. They may have a rational fear of contracting the virus and so choose to stay home. And then finally, there could be changes in work requirements that cause people to be able to work longer or shorter than they otherwise would. For instance, the ability to telework. On the disability application side of things, demand side factors might be that there's actual reductions in disability. People are no longer traveling to and from work. They may be able to work longer than they otherwise would have. And then also we have expanded UI benefits and stimulus payments that are unlike what we've seen in the past. And this may lead to people holding out longer for applying for disability insurance. On the supply side factors, there was reduced access to apply in the sense that there were substantial office closures of field offices. And there was also, if individuals had lack of internet access, they might have otherwise gone to a library, and those may have also been closed down. And then finally, it may have been more difficult to certify someone's medical condition, given that doctor office visits were limited to more urgent visits as well. So with that, I will pass it on to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was perfect. Next, we're happy to have David Weir. So you may share your screen and take it away.
Are you seeing my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So this project was conceived jointly with my colleague Gabor Kesdi, and he very much looked forward to presenting it to you all today. Very tragically, he died of cancer just a few weeks ago. So I've done my best to carry forward what we had intended to do. And I'm glad to be here today to do that. Let's see. All right. So at the time we designed it, there was only one economic impact payment. Now we have to qualify it. It was authorized in March of 2020. You may recall $1,200 per person and $500 for dependent children with an income cap at $75 per individual or $150 for couples. One of the things that we thought would be interesting was to look at the distribution of these funds in the older population and the role of Social Security in doing that. And that's because the IRS asked Social Security to handle the distribution to their beneficiaries. And the reason is that they have now an excellent distribution system, which is effectively 100% electronic. And I thank Michael Collins for pointing me to this paper of his on the last stages of conversion of their payment system to full electronic, and the people at the margins who maybe had a little more difficulty with that. But I did not know the government has its own debit MasterCard system called Direct Express that people can use for whatever government payments they may be receiving. He also suggested, which was a great idea, we could look at some of these effects according to how people receive the payment, whether they get it in a bank or not in a bank. And it turned out on our linked administrative records from Social Security, that variable was blacked out. We don't know who gets it other than through the bank. So hopefully we'll get that fixed. So it's always good to do this work to find out what you're missing. HRS and COVID-19 will be forever linked in my mind. We started the 2020 wave at the beginning of March. And of course, by the middle of March, all in-person research activity was closed down. So what we did was we continued to work our assigned telephone cases and held back the people who were assigned to in-person with the goal of releasing them when we could develop some new content to ask them stuff about COVID, including about the economic impact payment. And for the first time ever in our history, we made a data release in November of last year while we were still in the field collecting data. Here's a graphic of how our interviews coincide with the timing of the pandemic. The blue wave there is the number of cases reported, which you see, of course, was a big surge in the winter at the end of 20. Unemployment, and this is kind of ongoing claims, rose to a very high level in April and then has slowly worked its way down. And you see the green bar there is the HRS. So the first hump in March and April is us working the telephone cases. And then the next big hump there in June and July, that's the sample that I'm going to be using today. That's the people who were held back as in-person cases who were released then after we had developed the new content. And so you see, we've got our interviews going all the way through the pandemic, but mostly before the big surge in the winter. And so we're doing a mail survey right now to try and reflect back on the whole period, although apparently it's not over yet, but to try and reflect back and get more summary assessments of how everybody fared through it. All right, so the economic impact payment. We thought about designing our own and ultimately decided to go instead with questions that had been developed and used in previous stimulus episodes by Matthew Shapiro and Joel Slemrod, and are going to be, and were asked also in 2020, although we don't have data from their study yet. And so that's two questions, well, it's more than two, but the two key ones about did you get it? And then is it going to lead you to increase your spending or something else? So overall, in the HRS, 84% of households said they had received or expected to receive the economic impact payment when we asked them about it. Another 8% said they didn't expect to get it because their income was too high. We can't perfectly validate whether that's an accurate assessment, but it's not an unreasonable number given the cutoff on income and the distribution of income in the HRS. And another almost 8% said they didn't get it for other reasons. And that's the one group that I think is a little bit of a concern because that seemed high and perhaps reflected some confusion or lack of performance and delivery. So here it is by income. And so it's very sensible. The people who said, so these are quintiles of income. So in the top quintile of income, you have the highest rate of people who said they didn't get it because their income was too high. So that makes perfect sense. It's kind of surprisingly high at the bottom quintile. So either we've got some people who aren't telling us about their income very accurately or something else is going on. But you also see in that lowest income quintile, over 10% said they had other reasons for not getting it. And that is something I think is worth looking into. So we did at least look at it by race and ethnicity. And what really stands out, and by whether people received Social Security benefits, because if they were receiving Social Security benefits, then the Social Security distribution system should be fully in place for them. It should be effectively automatic that they get these payments. And if they're saying they're not, then either they're really ineligible for some reason, or they're just not aware of it. And you see, in general, people who are getting Social Security benefits are less likely to say they didn't get it for these other reasons. The group that really worries me is the Hispanics, particularly those who are not receiving Social Security. Now, there were legal restrictions on residency and legal status, as well as on tax filing, and you had to go through a process if you weren't a regular tax filer or Social Security beneficiary. It worries me that some of these people may have been eligible and just didn't get it. And that's something we'd like to look at a bit more. Oops. Okay, so summary, Social Security beneficiaries appear to have a little better awareness and fewer problems. Hispanics were less likely to get it, even when eligible by income, possibly due to those legal status issues. And we think we can do more to decide whether people are just confused or actually not getting it if we get the administrative records. All right, so the question of did the EIP stimulate spending? And again, in macroeconomics, the multiplier effect of a program like this is if people spend it, it has downstream effects stimulating the economy even more than the initial round of payments. So this is the question, did it lead you mostly to increase spending, mostly to increase saving, mostly to pay off debt, or what? The HRS veterans will recognize the or what. A few people said, yeah, I'm going with or what. And then they gave us answers. So my favorite of the group, because I had to go through them and code them, so we actually had a real value for them, was they gave us their whole life story. We were on the last cruises that sailed. Only one person got it, and no one that we know got sick. But we go on a cruise every year anyway, so really no increased spending other than normal. So they actually got the point. The question was not did you spend it on something, but did you spend it on something you wouldn't normally have spent it on? That's what we're trying to find out. And the answer was no, they didn't. Okay. So here's the comparison with previous stimulus payments for our age groups. We don't have, obviously, people under 50 in the HRS. And it's lower. It's particularly lower at 65 plus. And in all of these episodes, older people are more likely to spend than younger people. And there's good life cycle reasons why that should be true. But it's lower here. So was it related to pandemic shutdowns? And that was one of our key hypotheses initially, was we thought we would see effects that where shutdowns were more pronounced, there was more saving or debt reduction and less spending. And so globally in the US, many consumption opportunities were closed down. And so probably it had an impact on whether people spent. But we looked at the regional variation and could not find anything. First of all, by June, most states had reopened most businesses. And so the variation that's there is kind of limited, and it wasn't related to whether people spent or not. Some states had mask mandates in place, some didn't, and that didn't seem to be related to spending either. So, I mean, I'm not going to rule out that there's something out there, but in general, it doesn't seem to be related specifically to variation in pandemic mitigation efforts. Lose everything here. Let's see.
2 minutes.
All right, I skipped past a couple. Okay, the percent mostly spending the stimulus payment by income and by whether they're receiving Social Security benefits. You see people who get Social Security benefits, particularly those not in the highest income group, are much more likely to say they're going to spend it. And I assume that's because they felt confident that they were going to have income in the future and that, you know, whatever crazy pandemic stuff was coming, they would be okay to spend it, and that they were mostly settled in their life cycle plans. Whereas people who weren't yet receiving benefits were perhaps more worried about their future incomes and more concerned about their net worth. By race, it's really profound. Blacks were very unlikely to say they were going to spend it, and Hispanics somewhat less likely than whites, particularly if they're not receiving Social Security. So there were big differences by race in that. Here's the overall distribution of what people said they were going to do. And you see the big difference is people of color said they were going to use it to pay off debt at a rate of about 2/3. Whereas for whites, it was about equal. 40% would reduce debt, 40% would just save it, and 20% would spend it. So quite different patterns. And those patterns are also similar according to whether people experienced economic hardship. So we asked people, did your income go up or down as a result of the pandemic? And the majority said it stayed the same. But for those who said it went down, you see, again, they use it a lot more to pay off debt. and less to save or to spend. And for people who said they've actually experienced some difficulty paying some kinds of bills, they almost exclusively used it to reduce debt. So very sensitive to that.
Can you wrap it up? Thanks.
Yep. Okay. So by wealth, the Social Security benefits don't make a big difference. This is the savings behavior. So the wealthier you are, the more likely you were to say you'd save rather than pay off debt. Makes sense. We asked about charity, and about almost a third of people at all income levels said they were going to give some of it away, either to family members, friends, or a charity. All right. So conclusions. The EIP in the spring of 20 had the lowest impact on spending of any recent stimulus. Social Security beneficiaries were more likely to spend than similar other people. Persons of color and those experiencing hardship and those of low net worth were most likely to use the EIP to reduce debt. And for people with high net worth, it mainly augmented their savings. Oops, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very nice presentation. So you can stop sharing.
Yep.
Yep, thanks a lot. So now we have about 15 minutes for questions. Some people have put them in the Q&A. Some people have put them in the chat. I'm not quite sure. I'll try to look at both. So we had a question for Emily. The event study for employment showed that employment fell less for the older group, age 62 to 70 versus the 50 to 61-year-olds, and perhaps recovered more quickly. Any thoughts about why this is the case?
That's a great question. So I will say in terms of percentage points, yes, that is true. But if we look at as a percent relative to the mean, so the pre-period mean, employment was actually lower among the older workers prior. So it's a slightly larger decrease in employment for the older group. So it's an 11% decrease relative to the mean, relative to an 8% decrease for the 50 to 61-year-olds. In terms of the time pattern, we can say some things speculatively. One thing, if you compare the decrease in employment to the increase in the not in the labor force or the labor force exits, that might be suggestive of what's going on. So the labor force exits maintains a higher level for the older workers compared to the older workers. And so I think that could be part of what's going on, is that the 50 to 61-year-olds might be taking more of a wait and see approach. And there's a lot of the other labor force reasons for exits for other group.
Thank you. Question for Laura. So to put the two papers, the first and the last paper together, wouldn't it be likely that older workers who left the workforce during the pandemic might have held off on claiming Social Security benefits because they were getting those stimulus checks? And therefore, once the checks run out, which is happening now, might they then start claiming?
Yes, so absolutely. I think that's quite possible. And it's certainly one of the interpretations that we took away from it, was that we can't quite know as of yet whether the older workers who left the workforce, if they're ultimately going to claim Social Security once some of these other stimulus payments and unemployment insurance benefits and other resources that they could tap will run out, or whether they are really trying to hold off and maybe re-enter the workforce. I think time will tell on that one, although we may be able to start getting some data in pretty soon to start answering some of those questions.
Great. So David, one of the questions I was curious about is, can you possibly link these questions with the CAMS, which is the consumption and medical spending surveys that the HRS has been doing over the years, to see if there's any big changes there? Have you thought about that?
So the CAM survey is done in the fall of the odd numbered years. So we had it done in the fall of 2019 before any of this, and we'll be doing it again this fall. And we can certainly link that data to anything else in HRS, including the answers to these questions. Whether that will give us enough precision to see an impact on spending. I mean, it's $1,200 at one point in time. It's a lot to expect, I think, that we're going to see detectable effects in CAMs.
Thank you. Let's see, a question for Emily. I was struck by the fact that SSDI applications fell so much during the pandemic. It's not anything I would have anticipated, except for the fact that it's difficult to go get a hearing and get your application in and so forth. Could you look at breakdowns more specifically to see if those people just younger than age 62 were reducing their applications the most, figuring, oh, well, I'll go ahead and take my early benefits when the time comes?
That's a great question. We have not broken down the ages more specifically. We could probably get some power on that. I think in terms of access issues, one thing we've thought a bit about is, given that within the disability insurance decreased applications, a lot of it seems to be coming from SSI rather than SSDI. We thought that that was suggestive, maybe more of an access issue, given the office closures, if the SSI population tends to be more vulnerable.
And one other definitional question for you, Emily. People wanted to know exactly, how did you define jobs as being non-teleworkable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've adapted a definition that has been being used in the COVID literature. So we took our non-teleworkable, non-essential definition from Joanne Sue and Brooke Helpy McFall, and they took the non-teleworkable portion from Dingle and Neiman, who use ONET definitions. But in the paper, there's more information, but it's essentially jobs that likely can't be done via telework.
Great. Keep sending in questions, folks. I've got another one for Laura. What obstacles might stand in the way of older individuals returning to work over the next couple of years?
Yeah, so as I believe Emily mentioned earlier, we do know that during the Great Recession, older workers did want to return to work to try to recoup some of the financial market losses, but were largely unable to. Of course, this is a very different set of circumstances from back then, but unfortunately, COVID doesn't seem to be over. So some obstacles could include the ongoing health concerns due to the pandemic. Some workers may simply not want to return to work because they're concerned about contracting the virus. We also could look at employer demand for older workers, particularly in a period where we seem to be shifting towards more remote work arrangements, more telework, more hybrid models. Before the pandemic, there is research showing that employers perceived older workers as less technologically adept, whether or not that's correct. But that type of perception could be keeping employers from wanting to rehire older workers. Now, of course, that research was conducted before the pandemic. The pandemic itself and the widespread shift to telework might have changed some of these employer perceptions. So I think there's a lot more to be done in that area.
Thanks. So David, returning to you, what do you think of the primary question about how these payments affected spending? And is there a better way to ask that question in the future based on your experience?
I think for a number of reasons, one could do better. So the discussion just a couple questions ago about, did the stimulus payments allow people to stay out of work for a while? Well, you know, when you think about the ways in which an exogenous infusion of income could affect someone, they could choose to work less. And that's not an option on that schedule, just as giving it away is not really an option on that schedule. So I think on a little broader conceptualization of what people might do. But the other thing is you're really just finding out about the upper tail. Who says they're going to spend most of it? And in fact, they have a kind of a convoluted way of estimating the overall marginal propensity to consume, which assumes something about the people who say they're going to mostly do something else. because they will spend some of it. But if you just ask them, all right, you said you're not going to mostly spend it. Are you going to spend any of it? And if so, like what percent? And they said in one of the early papers, they thought that would be too complicated. But I mean, we asked people on a 100-point scale, what's your probability of surviving to age 75? I think we could probably ask them, how much of this do you think you're going to spend versus save? So I think we could do better at getting a more precise estimate as well.
So just to follow up with you, David, so Dakoma Esta had an interesting question. She said, were the impact payments sent at the same time as the regular SSA benefits? Because in the literature, people have made use of the fact that the weekly payments can be thought of as random since it's based on your Social Security number. And that literature finds that consumption differs depending on when the checks arrive.
Not overall, you mean the timing of consumption is correlated with the timing of the arrival of the checks? I think
Right.
That's what you're saying. So that's an excellent question. And one of the reasons I'd really love to get the 2020 administrative data to know how much people got and when they got it. And then we could look at some of that.
Super. So Laura, you also have some thoughts, I think, about what unresolved questions about older workers, labor force participation might be able to be addressed as new data become available.
Yes. So this came up a few times in both my presentation and Emily's presentation, that I think while we know that many older workers did leave employment, it's a lot less clear, first of all, how they've been bridging the gap, because we know they haven't been claiming Social Security. So what resources have they been tapping into in order to be able to do that? I think answering those questions are first order, and also something that we could all start to look at in the near future as more data becomes available on workers' financial assets along the lines of what David is doing. The second set of questions that has been coming up repeatedly is, will older workers be able to return to the labor force? And if so, what are those new jobs going to look like? Are they going to be as good as the jobs that older workers had before the pandemic started? Will they have the same hours, the same benefits and salaries? It's not clear. And I think that will really determine how older workers ultimately fare in retirement.
The question to any or all three of you, is there any evidence on whether access to field offices or the lack thereof suppressed claiming, and how many people, has anybody tracked the reduction in claiming by the field office closures?
We've thought a little bit about this, but haven't been able to do much with the data that we have. So in terms of thinking about it from the shutdown perspective, we have done sub-analyses looking at places that were more shut down versus less shut down. And that did not seem to affect the drop in disability. So it was similar whether or not the place was more or less shut down. In terms of the physical applications on the retirement, we do show a shift in people applying more online now than before, but we haven't been able to do a similar analysis on the disability side.
So
is it possible to know if field offices were closed? I mean, specifically
when they closed and when they reopened? In fact, are any of the offices reopened by now or not?
They all shut down on the same day. I know that.
Okay.
I don't know if they've reopened. Yeah, exactly. There is no variation we could leverage on that front.
But no evidence on whether some have reopened or not. Does anybody know about that? I mean, my sense is a lot of government folk are still working from home. So it may be that there's not much to learn from that yet. So let's see, Steve Sass had a question. Hi, Steve. Any thoughts about the effect of the PPP program on employment, labor force, and the enhanced unemployment benefits on the same labor force statistics? David, I guess maybe you'd be the most close to that.
I guess you're asking the question, if people were kept employed and paid because of a government program that paid their employers to do that, do we need to make, how should they be treated in labor force statistics? And people have differences of opinion. I remember doing historical work on unemployment that had the same thing about all the WPA projects and things like that. And the Depression, if you count those people as employed, you get a different unemployment rate than if you don't.
Sure.
And so I don't have an opinion about that. I assume they've been counted as employed, but you'd have to ask the CPS folks how they handled it.
Let's see. We do have an answer in the chat. The Social Security office in my city is open by appointment only for dire need cases. So they're patchy as yet, which makes sense. I think I've pretty much exhausted the questions. Is there anything that each of you might like to say in closing? Briefly.
I think a lot of what we'll learn will come in the next year as, you know, the programs that are UI benefits start to expire and the programs and the stimulus checks stop. We'll learn more about whether people are gonna, how much of the people are gonna return to work and so forth. So.
Right, and I suspect also that it takes a while to put in an SSDI application. You need to go through the medical and so forth. And so there's probably going to be a lag effect across all the different outcomes. Well, thank you so much. This has been an excellent panel. I will turn it back to Michael to take us to the next step on the program. Much appreciated.